among the agricultural, nomadic, and hunter peoples of the African continent who were influenced by European conquest. In the 19th and 20th centuries, there was one region in particular that, as a result of this colonization, witnessed a complete transformation of its way of life. A nation that continues to be talked about to this day. What we know today as South Africa, conquered and built as a modern state by the English and Dutch, but with a majority African population, with a majority black population, and as one of the richest possessions of the British Empire, would see, in the midst of its controversial racial segregation policies, the birth of a man who is one of the few to enjoy an almost universal consensus as a figure revered for the good of humanity. We are talking about Rolihlahla Mandela, later known as Nelson Mandela. But how much of what is said about this figure is legend and fantasy, and how much is reality? The protagonist of a long and difficult life, he is remembered as one of the most ardent defenders of human rights and pacifism. But today we're going to learn his story beyond the propaganda in the most objective way possible. This is Reynaldo José Carrillo Vilches speaking. This is La Nueva Enciclopedia. And for those who don't know, let me remind you that we now have La Nueva Enciclopedia in English and La Nueva Enciclopedia in Portuguese. You can give us great support by visiting both platforms, which you can find below, subscribing to both channels, liking the videos, leaving your comments, and watching the content, which has a lot of potential. Without further ado, let's start with today's video. Nelson Mandela, born with the name Rolihlahla Mandela, came into the world on July 18, 1918, in the village of Mweso, in the Eastern Cape Province, a province that at that time belonged to the so-called Union of South Africa, which was the political and administrative entity through which the British Empire governed its territories in southern Africa in a unified way. His name Mandela came from the native language of his ethnic group, which jokingly meant something like troublemaker. Mandela's parents were descendants of a lineage of ancient tribal chiefs and were well positioned in their tribe, which was called the Thembu Kingdom. For this reason, at the age of 7, they managed to send Mandela to a Methodist school in his hometown. At that school, his teacher gave him the name Nelson, and the young Mandela, not knowing why he was being given this new name, accepted it. Shortly after, at the age of 9, his father died, and because of this, his mother entrusted young Nelson to the care of the tribal chief named Jonquintaba Dalindievo. This was a common practice among prominent tribal families when parents died, since under the care of the tribal chief, a certain future could be guaranteed for the young people left without a father. In this way, Nelson moved to live with the tribal chief, Jonquintaba, in the Mekashweni Palace. Being raised by the chief of his tribe was a decisive event in his life, which allowed Mandela to have an education and a privileged position. He also learned from a young age various notions of leadership and acquired advanced knowledge about the history and geography of his native country. In 1935, he began his secondary education in the town of Nkobo, although he would finish them in 1939 in Beaufort, at prestigious institutions for the African community in the region. As the adopted son of a tribal chief, Mandela received a privileged education and formed friendships with members of other tribes. And although the instruction focused on history from the English point of view, Mandela began to develop a preference for the history of South Africa, its native tribes, their customs, and life before the arrival of the English. Thus, anti-imperialist and anti-colonialist ideas began to take root in young Mandela's mind. After finishing high school, Mandela began his university studies at the University of Fort Hare, which was exclusively for the Black African community in the town of Alice. Mandela chose to study for a degree in arts, but he took different classes in various subjects, such as anthropology, politics, colonial administration theory, Roman and English law, among others. However, the following year, in 1940, Mandela was suspended from the university for participating in some protests related to the quality of the food provided at the university. After this, he returned to the Makiswini Meckelson Palace. He was surprised to find out that his adoptive father had arranged a marriage for him with a woman he didn't even know. Mandela decided to escape to Johannesburg, which, although it was not the capital of the South African colonial territory, was a city of great economic importance due to its mining activity. In Johannesburg, Mandela went through a period that, although marked by economic hardships he had never experienced before, allowed him to learn a lot about the situation in his country and the political movements that were emerging. Around this time, he made contact with members of the nascent South African Communist Party, whose proposal for equal treatment among blacks, whites, and mixed-race people caught his attention. And even though he did not join the Communist Party because he believed that the South African issue was not a class problem, but a racial one, Mandela participated together with members of that party in small boycotts and student protests against racial segregation, and he came to sympathize with several of the communist principles. Beyond this, Mandela managed to return to university in 1943 and enrolled in law school at the University of Witwatersrand, which was in Johannesburg. And the young Nelson Mandela, 25 years old, did not know that his time at this university was going to change his life forever. Now then, before continuing with the life of Nelson Mandela, it is first necessary to delve deeper into the history of his nation, a history little known by many, which is the history of South Africa. Before the arrival of the Europeans, the territory that is now known as South Africa was home to a diverse array of tribes and native communities. With very hierarchical and complex divisions, these tribes, despite their technical disadvantage compared to other nations that were technologically superior, were extremely warlike and combative. Among these tribes, the San, the Khoikhoi, and the Bantu peoples stood out, each of which formed continuous confederations and alliances to expand or to fight against each other. In 1487, the Portuguese, under the command of Bartolomeu Dias, rounded the Cape of Good Hope on the western part of the country, being the first Europeans to reach this place. After their arrival, the southern region of Africa became an important territorial prize for the European powers, due to its privileged geographical position, among other reasons. However, it would not be the Portuguese but the Dutch who would plant their flag in this area in 1652 through the so-called Dutch East India Company. This was a company authorized by the monarchy of the Netherlands to colonize and commercially exploit territories across Africa and the Americas. Thus, the Dutch would create the first settlements on the South African coast to supply ships traveling from Europe to Asia and vice versa, an activity that was essential for world trade. The Dutch gradually penetrated the interior of South African territory, subduing by force, or at least attempting to subdue the native tribes that lived there, from which men were taken to form the great slave monopoly that the Dutch held for several decades. However, in 1806, in the context of the Napoleonic Wars, the English, taking advantage of the Dutch weakness, decided to forcibly occupy their territories. So from 1820 onwards, thousands of English settlers began to settle on the coasts of South Africa, creating a series of provisional colonies. On their side, the so-called Boers, that is, the descendants of the former Dutch settlers, undertook the so-called Great Trek into the interior of the African territory, and they created two new settlements that they proclaimed as two new independent republics. The so-called Orange Free State and the Republic of Transvaal between 1835 and 1840. Among other things, to maintain their sovereignty and counteract English influence. However, the English were not going to look favorably on this. And from 1877, they launched a campaign to exterminate the Boer communities and proceeded with the colonization of the entire South African territory. So by 1902, after several years of war and violence, in what has been called the Anglo-Boer conflict, the British took full control of South Africa, dissolving the nations created by the Boers and integrating them into the territory under their rule. For their part, by this same time, the English had already finished subjugating all the native tribes of South Africa under their power, the most remembered of them being the Zulu, who fought the colonizers fiercely until the year 1906. So by this time, South African society presented the following picture. There was a European ruling class that directed the fate of the colony, made up of English and the so-called Afrikaners, who were the descendants of the former Dutch Boers. They also had their own dialect called Afrikaans, which was a hybrid language between Dutch, English, and Portuguese, with several native languages such as Zulu. This European ruling class, they not only held political power, since they were the only ones allowed to hold public office within this state, which was formed as a colonial administration, but they also held economic power. They were the ones who, since the conquest, had built and established the economic structure of that region. They were, therefore, the main owners of the factories, businesses, and cultivated agricultural lands in South Africa. On the other hand, there was the vast majority of Black Africans in the country who made up about 84% of the population. This Black African majority was in a state of complete dependence on the white Europeans. They mainly served as a labor force for the state and were not allowed to participate in politics or public administration. They were barred from commerce and from certain public places, such as schools, universities, government buildings, and others. There was racial segregation, and their movement within the territory of the South African Union was extremely limited. These prohibitions, although severe, were not uniformly enforced, and their strictness varied depending on the time and place. All of this was justified by the argument that it was the Europeans who had built this system and that they were the only ones capable of running it. By 1910, the English created and proclaimed what we have referred to as the Union of South Africa, which brought everything under a single political and administrative entity. The different English colonies provisionally established in the territory throughout the Anglo-Boer conflict and the former independent Dutch republics, the British authorities gave the Union of South Africa a high degree of autonomy and granted de jure, because it already existed de facto, political and economic power to the ruling class of European whites in the country. This was done through a national assembly elected by the white European community, born in that region and renewed every 5 years, from which all the laws for the autonomous government of the English colony originated. Soon, due to this great autonomy, the first political parties began to organize in South Africa to compete for power within the country. The most important ones to know about, and which we will discuss later, are the Unionist Party and the National Party, both founded during the 1910s. The first, the Unionist Party, will share a more egalitarian vision of South African society, supporting a gradual integration of Black people with white people in a shared society. However, the National Party, which enjoyed the approval of the majority of white European voters, was completely opposed to this vision, defending the preservation of the existing order and racial separation. Accordingly, during the 1920s and 1930s, from the assembly and the various governing bodies of the Union of South Africa, the National Party would enact several laws, such as the Native Land Act and the Native Act, which legalized the existing order, and the racial segregation that already existed as a social norm was now formally governed by the legal apparatus of the Union of South Africa. The white European class that had built this system and the state of the Union of South Africa considered it harmful and a threat to give the same leadership and management opportunities to the local black community. Even those who supported integration between Europeans and Africans believed that it should be gradual and subject to various restrictions. It could also be said that although South Africa nominally belonged to the United Kingdom, its ruling class was already governing itself. This is going to be the complex situation in which Mandela will spend his youth. However, it would still be a few years before the situation reached a boiling point, and Mandela also reached a key moment in his life. As we mentioned earlier, Mandela returned to university in 1943 in Johannesburg, studying law. He combines this with a job at a modest law firm, which helps him gain experience in the legal field. Although the university where he studied openly admitted black students, Mandela was the only black student at that institution, which made his student years a complex and difficult experience. During this period, as a student and worker, Mandela marries a young woman named Evelyn Nkoto in October 1944, with whom he will have 4 children in the next decade. Returning to the university, he met a wide variety of people who would introduce him to political activism. Not only black South Africans, but also white South Africans with a liberal and egalitarian mindset, as well as important Jewish and Hindu people who lived in South Africa. Thanks to the influence of these people, Mandela joined the ranks of the political party called the African National Congress at the end of 1944. The African National Congress, or ANC, by its English initials, was initially a sort of civil association founded by the black South African politician John Langaliba Lili, also called John Duve. The African National Congress was founded in January 1912 with the purpose of fighting for the right to vote for black people and their right to political participation, as well as against the policies of racial segregation and the practices of racial separation, which were both institutional and social in that country. A few decades later, in the 1940s, the ANC was reformed by its leaders and began to take on the character of a mass party, and in addition, to develop a broad political platform that sought to encompass all sectors of society. In this way, with the same ideals of reclaiming the political rights of black South Africans, the ANC began to lead the first strikes, boycotts, and peaceful demonstrations, which initially called for nonviolence, especially knowing they were at a technical disadvantage. In this sense, since joining the organization, Mandela gradually became a key figure within it. He quickly stood out among his peers, and around this time he became a co-founder of the ANC Youth League, where he would become tremendously popular among young South Africans. He was elected as a member of the local party committee in the Transvaal region in 1947, thus climbing the party ranks and gaining popularity among the people. However, several events of great importance were about to occur for South Africa. Given that the white ruling class governed the territory with complete autonomy, in 1948 the usual elections were held to elect a new National Assembly of the Union of South Africa. The two dominant parties were the Unionist Party and the National Party, now called the Reunited National Party, along with others such as the Labour Party and the Afrikaans Party. These parties participated in the elections, and the Reunited National Party, led by Daniel Francois Malan, won 70 out of 150 seats. 150 seats in the Assembly of the Union of South Africa, while the Unionist Party, led by Jan Smuts, won 65 seats, and the remaining minority parties obtained the other 15 seats. Thus, with its majority in the Assembly, in May of that year, 1948, the reunited National Party passed one of the most controversial policies of its time, what has come to be known as apartheid. Apartheid, which in the Afrikaans language or dialect means separation, was a broad set of rules specifically for racial separation, which already existed to a large extent previously, but were now synthesized and organized into a single framework for the entire country. Systematically grouping these policies regarding the black population and adding some new ones. The purpose of these measures was to formalize once and for all the separation between whites and blacks in South African territory, and to ensure the preservation of the political, economic, and social order of that state. In the view of the white ruling class, they were the descendants of those who had built that system and saw the exponential growth of egalitarian movements in that country as a serious threat. Among the main measures of apartheid policies were the legal prohibition of interracial marriage, the legal prohibition of interracial sexual relations, massive residential segregation, that is, the designation of segregated and exclusive residential areas. For both the white community and the black community, the relocation of black families living in white areas, the total exclusion of black people from political life, strict supervision of their mobility, and the designation of separate recreational, educational, and hospital areas for the black South African community and the white South African community. In this way, the South African nation was now formally, officially, and institutionally divided between blacks and whites. There were numerous reactions regarding the approval of apartheid policies. The majority of the white population received the news with enthusiasm and supported this new system. The black community, along with other liberal whites such as those from the Unionist Party and other parties like the Communist Party, widely rejected this program of measures. At the same time, the international community also strongly condemned these policies and unsuccessfully urged the British government to take action on the matter. For Mandela, whose ideals were more than clear, the enactment of these apartheid measures represented a complete call to struggle and activism by any means. Thus, Mandela and the other regional leaders of the party began to lead the African National Congress down what he called a more radical and revolutionary path. Massive strikes and protests began to take place, which were quickly and harshly repressed by the government. However, the president of the executive committee and main leader of the African National Congress, named Alfred Zuma, refused to support this policy of radicalizing the struggle. And for refusing to support these confrontational and conflictive measures, he ends up being removed from his position by consensus of the majority of the leaders of the African National Congress. Therefore, in March 1950, Nelson Mandela, who was already enjoying great popularity and national recognition, takes over the party's executive committee and also assumes the presidency of the party's youth league, becoming practically the top leader of the African National Congress. So now the party decides, with Mandela as leader, to launch a campaign of what was called peaceful resistance, inspired by the activism of Mahatma Gandhi as a form of protest. This method was followed by some of his supporters, but most of the party took to the streets violently, and a large number of riots broke out, leading the authorities to use force to restore public order. This goes on in parallel with intense activism and political organization. The campaigns launched by the African National Congress take effect, and its membership grows from 20,000 in 1951 to more than 100,000 members by the following year, 1952. However, this begins to trouble the authorities, who enact the so-called Public Safety Act that same year. And under this law, they carry out a large number of arrests and detentions to thwart the activities of the African National Congress. So under this law, Mandela is arrested again on July 30, but this time he is put on trial along with 21 other prisoners, being sentenced to 9 months in prison with hard labor. However, by order of the South African authorities, this sentence is suspended and Mandela is not actually imprisoned. However, the surveillance and persecution against him becomes increasingly strict, since the South African authorities forbid him from presiding over or participating in public meetings. Thus, Mandela, always watched by the authorities, reduces his activism during these years. Although due to his involvement in politics, Mandela is unable to finish his law degree, he passes the exam to practice as a lawyer, and in 1953, together with his friend Oliver Tambo, he creates the first black law firm in South Africa. Around this time, he also begins to have marital problems with his wife Evelyn. Due to Mandela's discomfort, he was subjected to a year of state surveillance. However, this surveillance seemed to loosen at times and was not always so strict depending on the situation, since Mandela still found ways to appear at party demonstrations and public activities. Now, by December 5, 1956, the ANC, the African National Congress, made several calls for the unity of all Africans, black and white, under its banner, and several hints about the possibility of formalizing and openly calling for armed struggle against the apartheid system and the entire South African state. After this, Mandela is arrested again and placed in a maximum security prison in Johannesburg for crimes of high treason against the Union of South Africa. This marked the beginning of what became known in history and public opinion as the Treason trial, to which Mandela and 155 other South Africans were subjected. This would be an extremely long and tedious process during the 1950s, but it would shock South Africa and the entire world. What comes next for the South African nation can be seen in the second part of this documentary, which you can find right below this video. Thank you all very much for watching this video. I hope you enjoyed it. And I remind you that below you can find La Nueva Enciclopedia in English and La Nueva Enciclopedia in Portuguese. Like all the videos on those channels, share them with your friends, check out the material that's really worth it, and, well, subscribe to both platforms. Thank you all very much, and may God bless you.